Once again, current events demand a full-throated response from us that demand that we set aside our planned schedule of talks. I must apologize for the fact that I'm wearing a hat as well. I've been wearing hats now for a couple of weeks to avoid having to explain to friends and strangers why I have bandages on top of my head. But here on YouTube, the hat deserves some apology and explanation. I had a non-invasive carcinoma removed from my balding scalp that now gets a little too much sunshine on it. I'll be fine. Thanks for your concern. The victims of the racially motivated murders at the Tops grocery store in Buffalo, New York, had not actually all been buried yet when the news cycle was interrupted by the murder of twice as many people, most of whom were fourth grade children, in the Robb Elementary School in a quiet little ranching town near the border with Mexico in southern Texas. Normally stoic TV news reporters have regularly not been able to maintain their composure this week as they have continued to update us on the details of this horrible event. I have, all week, gone to bed crying and waken up crying every day. It happens all the time, but we cannot accept these mass murders as any kind of a new normal. It is still just the saddest thing in the world. I don't even have grandchildren, but I've recently been promised that I will have grandchildren soon, and now I'm already afraid to send them to school. America is not safe. Mass murders have taken place in the United States with greater frequency and with larger numbers of victims over the past decade. And it's not just schools, of course. As you know, it happens in shopping centers, movie theaters, churches, synagogues, mosques, city parks, country music shows, gay bars, as well as in our universities, high schools, and elementary schools. We have had 288 school shootings since 2009. But here's the question that has to be answered. Why? Why, in the last dozen years, we've had 288 school shootings? Canada had 2. France had 2. Germany had 1. Japan didn't have any. Italy didn't have any. The United Kingdom didn't have any. What makes us so different? Are Americans inherently more violent than other Western democracies? Do we have more mental health problems? Is racial strife that much worse here than it is anywhere else? Do we have that big of a problem with drug addiction, domestic violence? Do our kids play more violent video games than anyone else? Why are we so much of an outlier in the whole world? While there are countries that have a higher death rate from guns than we do, those are typically poor countries often embroiled in civil wars. We have the highest death rate among Western democracies. But where the numbers are really crazy is in how many guns we have in private hands. Most Americans, like me, most Americans, 60% of Americans, don't own guns. Only about 37% of us do. But a few years ago, we actually crossed the line where there are more guns in America than there are people. For every 100 people, there are now 120 guns. Gun sales have risen rapidly during the pandemic, and sadly, this could be a talk all on its own, but gun sales spike after every single mass murder, especially mass murders in schools. Gun sales went up after the Sandy Hook murder more than they did during the early months of the pandemic, as I am certain they will be going up this week in the wake of the Texas school shooting. What is different about the United States? Why is this such a horrible problem for us and hardly a problem at all among our peers in the world. It isn't violent video games. Japanese kids play video games more than American children do, although I find it hard to imagine how they find the time. But they have virtually no incidents of school shootings. They have virtually no mass murders, and gun deaths in Japan average 7 or 8 a year, while ours are now over 40,000. Americans do not have more mental illness than other countries, though it must be said that politicians who cite mental illness as the cause of our mass murders, while they actively work to stop the expansion of Medicaid, a primary provider of mental health services to the age group most often seen as the shooters in these school mass murders, is too hypocritical to let pass. It must also be said that people with mental health diagnoses are much more likely to be the victim than to be the victimizer in shootings. Let me now pause for a brief aside to applaud the controversial and broadly criticized appearance of Beto O'Rourke at a news conference in which Texas Governor Greg Abbott was spewing lies and propaganda about the Texas school shooting. Beto was the first person in that meeting to even utter the word guns. And I am glad that he showed up, and I am glad that he publicly challenged the lies and propaganda. I get that it was uncomfortable. I get that it didn't look good. But if anyone finds Beto's appearance there to be offensive in light of the lies Abbott was telling about mental illness and the deaths of 19 fourth-grade children, let me suggest that you have not yet begun to think critically about ethics. We have learned the steps to a public dance that is carefully orchestrated every time there's a mass shooting. We've seen this dance rehearsed every time mass murders get into the news, especially in these past 10 years since Sandy Hook. First Republicans, as well as spokespersons for the National Rifle Association, tell us that it is too soon to talk about politics or policy. They don't say that after a terrorist attack. They don't say that when other things go wrong. But after guns are used in a mass murder, they say that we have to respect the grieving families. We must mourn before we can discuss what must be done to prevent these incidents. Then we are met with trite sayings about how gun regulations do not work, even though they clearly do work in every other Western democracy in the world. We are told that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. When I was in public schools, I don't think anybody spent a dime on security for school buildings. Now we are spending $3 billion a year on armed guards, security doors and windows, and hardened school infrastructure. And yet, a single kid can buy himself an assault rifle on his 18th birthday and that very week walk right past armed guards and kill 19 children, 2 teachers, and wound 17 other people before a good guy showed up with a gun to stop him. So again, why is mass murder an American disease? Simply put, it is because we have too many guns. They are too easy to buy, and there are too few regulations in place as to who can have access to them. This isn't complicated. The more guns we have, the more people die from guns. As Stephen Colbert pointed out this week, that's why we have relatively few deaths from catapults. Folks, we have more gun shops than we have grocery stores. We have more than 3 times as many gun shops as we have McDonald's locations in America. We have gun shops next to the sports and toy departments in many of our department stores. You know how many gun shops there are in Mexico? 1. But we have 6,000 gun shops in the states along the border with Mexico. So, okay, we have more mass murders because we have more guns, and guns that are easier to acquire and have little more than symbolic regulations or requirements to own them. But that begs the question, why don't we have meaningful regulations? Why are guns so easy to buy here? Why can an 18-year-old buy an assault rifle when they can't buy a beer? And this gets to the crux of the matter, because we have one political party in the United States, one of the two leading political parties, that has consistently stood in opposition to every single attempt at reforming gun laws and saving the lives of our elementary students, our shoppers, our country music fans, and churchgoers, and that is the Republican Party. There are Democratic politicians in purple states who try to stay on the right side of the gun lobby in order to garner votes, but just look at the numbers. The politicians who get the most money in donations from the gun lobby are all Republicans. And of course, no one gets anything like as much as the most despicable Republican senator, Ted Cruz, who at least in this sermon is worse than even Mitch McConnell, and even I can't believe that I am saying that out loud, that there is someone who is more detestable than Mitch McConnell. Last week, I delivered another out-of-sequence talk in response to the inevitable overturning of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that has, for 50 years, protected the constitutional right of all women to make reproductive decisions for themselves. Last week, I insisted that the Republican Party had gone over the line and is no longer a legitimate American political party. And I'm back here again this week to say more or less the same thing from a different perspective. I've been a minister for 43 years. For the first 30 years of my life in ministry, I never so much as put a bumper sticker on my car. I never put a political sign in my yard. I was careful that if I ever publicly was critical of a politician from one party, that I would include another criticism of a politician from the other party, because I was determined to be nonpartisan. And you know what? I insist that I am still nonpartisan, because this isn't about political parties. This is about ethics. But in recent votes regarding protecting women's rights to reproductive health, and in votes this week to protect the rights of elementary school children to be allowed to live, Republicans have voted in a block against every measure. They don't break ranks. It isn't that McConnell and Cruz are uniquely evil. Their whole party votes together in a way that makes me say to you that they are no longer a viable political party in the United States, even if they once were. They are not now. This isn't about disagreements. This isn't about political parties. This is about right and wrong. This is about life and death. This week, for the 21st time, the satirical news site, The Onion, has repeated the same headline about mass murder in public schools. The headline reads, "No way to prevent this, says the only nation where this regularly happens." You and I know that there is a way to prevent this. It is prevented in every other Western democracy. We need effective, sensible gun laws, and the only way we will ever get them is to never again vote for a Republican. It is not going too far to say in this day that voting for a Republican is voting in favor of murdering school children, and there is no remaining excuse for that.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.